he hates these cans, and they're pointing in the wrong direction. We could say this now because we know it, but they didn't know that. And so a lot of this poisoning, a lot of this spinal column damage was likely caused by this massive influx of lead, mercury, all these other things. And the science had irreparably broken off a branch where this is how we go down things. And they had what the author believes is a false premise from the beginning, where they had started going down this thing, and it changed how science responds to this day, 120, 130, 140 years later, because they made this leap that has now become so doctrinal, you don't dare attack it. And so we live in a time now where all these different things, we can go back in time and go, hey, it turns out mercury in our bodies is really hard to figure out how to do that well. So thank you for coming on, and thank you for all the work that you do. I was watching a bunch of stuff on your website, and it's marvelous to see just all of this access to all of this research. So, man, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
When I tell you that story about moths, and I can post a link to the book, but we're going to talk about your book more importantly. Does that shock you in any way that scientists kind of latched onto a direction and then started a whole multi-generational tree of advancement on this mistaken branch?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that polio is caused only by things like that. I think it's also possible these could be like these insecticides and things could be reactivating things in the body. But they had these outbreaks going on a while. I know that a lot of things got classified as polio that probably wasn't, but then after they did that polio vaccine, they reclassified everything. Well, they reclassified it as syndromes and made it sound like the vaccine made it go away. Because the insecticides wouldn't explain how people are getting vaccine-induced polio.
Right. Yeah. And
people are getting paralytic. People are getting the classic paralytic polio thing from that vaccine. Now, right. I would say, the insecticides thing, this could also, I would say, perhaps could mirror that, could produce conditions that mirror that.
Yeah.
But I would say based on all of the research that I had done, that I had seen that this was something, it may have actually been a different bioweapon. Because America had poliovirus in their biological weapons stockpile. A lot of people don't know that, but when all of this started, like the first outbreaks started to happen in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now this is at a time when there was all of this false flag antagonism going on with the foot and mouth disease virus, where British intelligence were infecting cattle, heading to Germany. Germany was like, whoa, we're being attacked by America. They thought we did that on purpose. So this started to foment this like antagonism between these two countries, and it was Britain in the middle doing it.
Yeah.
To play sides against each other. And so one thing is foot and mouth disease virus. The virus of foot and mouth disease is very close to the polio virus. They're both in this coronavirus family. And that's when we started to see it. So I sometimes I wonder, I don't know if it was something that was in the meat that was took to the digestive tract or whatnot, but they were also concerned that mosquitoes were spreading at one point. So a lot of times the cases would be going up and they'd be spraying more and more under the pretense that it's possibly being spread by mosquitoes. But in my book, I go through a very deep, complex war that's been playing out, and a lot of the bioweapons are not what most people would consider as the biological weapon, because these were agents that did not kill you. Like the real valuable biological weapons were those that tire and exhaust rather than kill you outright. And this is why, because they were done with complete stealth. So it wasn't entirely apparent that the person was sick, but it would slowly tire and exhaust them. It would start overwhelming a country slowly, and it would be like an economic burden. And usually, like in a fatal disease, what happens is they're easy to track. Like the real apparent diseases that are often fatal, they're very apparent when they hit their victims, and then for that reason they're easier to track and contain. And for whatever reason, they tend to burn out faster. But these different ones that Erich Traub had specialized in,
right?
These were a certain, and the bioweapon to him was this certain antigen or lipoprotein. It was a little protein that he added onto. He could add them onto viruses. He could add them onto spirochetes and things of that nature. And these are things that have been, they're purified and they're used in many of today's modern day vaccines.
Yeah.
And they tend to just throw the immune system into disarray. And that's why you'll see a lot of people will get a very similar disease as chronic Lyme disease from a routine vaccination.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And, I've known people that this has happened to. I myself had adverse reaction when I was in 8th grade to something, and I didn't realize it till much later. And I looked, there was a congressional hearing, and it was listing all of this. It was a congressional hearing on the Hep B vaccine, and it was like, debating because it was causing all these problems in all these people. And I'm like, hey, that's exactly what happened to me. And it was like the same year too, 1998. Yeah. But now Erich Traub, he discovered this condition, this debilitating condition, and it was called immune tolerance. That's what they ended up calling it, but it would be more. They also use the term immune paralysis, which is a more apt term, and this kind of just destroys the immune system. Or at least it whacks it really hard, and it takes a while for the immune system to bounce back. Like it can bounce back, but it when you get that classic form of it, it can be very hard, and you can be very sick for a number of years. And so that's what happened to me, and that's kind of like what drove me. Now, what the strange thing about this is that, and this is what Erich Traub had found early on, is that the person will have very little to no antibodies, right? Very little inflammation. Like you go in, you get scans or whatever, there'll be very little inflammation involved. So then these people end up getting told, oh, you're not sick. We don't see anything wrong with you. Like a lot of the people, the chronic fatigue syndrome people, a lot of the Gulf War syndrome people, a lot of they call it myalgic encephalomyelitis, the really bad headaches. I remember they did a documentary on it trying to make this guy look crazy, like he was imagining his disease. And Erich Traub's work actually shows that these people actually do have an infection, and it's very stealth. And that was his specialty. That's what he was trying to do. And it's very demoralizing for these people to be sick like that, and then to try to go in and get help, and they're told, oh, there's nothing wrong with you. I mean, this is like millions of people now are on this boat. I was one of them too. And so when RFK is talking about the chronic disease epidemic in America, like this is all of that chronic disease can be traced to immunosuppression, that the immune system is not working properly. That's why people are plagued with these chronic health problems. Well, that's basically all in the same realm as what Erich Traub had found, immune tolerance. And
Does this also impact like things like testosterone? You know, because
oh yeah, I mean
average male, yeah,
it would affect the entire body. Yeah, I mean it would affect the entire system.
right,
It would and it would be different for each person too, but you
right,
generally have, yeah, that would be something that I would say absolutely. And then, you know, people's hormones getting all messed up, and you know, maybe some of them have a lot of estrogen or something, and then they think they're girls or whatever. I mean, that's just, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I haven't looked specifically at that, but these are things that I would expect that, you know, because when I say it affects the whole system, it does. Like it affects the organs. I mean, your immune system is very important. It's not just for fending off things, but keeping your vitality, your
yeah,
health. And it's just it's really a bad thing when you have not only these biological weapons that are filtering through the population, but them trying to use vaccines with that same antigen that Erich Traub was using as his weapons, it does the same damage. And perhaps perhaps they think they're doing something good, but I tend to think they know all about this because they were having conferences in the 1970s. So they did something really crazy. They gave the Nobel Prize for immune tolerance to two guys that never worked together. They weren't nominated by anybody. And what they did was they made this immune tolerance thing about organ transplant recipients because the same thing could happen. It's the same exact, and it has to do with antigens that are in the organs, right?
yeah,
And so the body's like rejecting it, and it just makes the immune system go haywire. But what they wanted to do was they wanted to make it only about organ transplant recipients so that all of the stuff about infectious antigen would be overlooked, because if they admitted that, then they would have had a real problem in the vaccine industry, because they would have seen that this is also causing it, and they would have seen some massive flaws in their whole antibody theory of immunity, which is a lot of what Erich Traub's work shows. It kind of flips it on its head to how we understand immunity. And what he showed is that there are actually two sides of disease. There's the acute disease with heavy inflammation and immune response. And then there's immunosuppression, where there's almost no inflammation, but you still feel horrible on it. You can still be in a lot of discomfort. Like my elbow, for example, it just hurts like hell, even though it's not inflamed and everything, but it feels like somebody drove a hammer through my elbow. You know what I mean?
mm-hmm.
And so the pain can still be there just as bad. It doesn't show up as anything, and it doesn't look on the outset like there's anything wrong with it. And that's kind of like what he had shown. And so I'm guessing that whole Nobel Prize thing, they were trying to do that because, you know, it would really put a thorn in the side of Big Pharma that they didn't want to deal with. And it also, you know, because all of Erich Traub's, so they sent him back to Germany after he came over here in Operation Paperclip, after they had realized that he got over here with the help of a guy named Donald McLean, who had defected to Moscow, you know, as a double agent. And basically they realized that a lot of the Nazis that they sent over here through him were also double agents. And so they put Erich Traub at like the top of our biological warfare program. He was pretty much advising them on how to run the program, because they were, you know, America wasn't as advanced as Nazi Germany when it came to these things. And over in Germany, he ran a facility. It was like the American version of Plum Island, but way before Plum Island, and it was called Insel Reims. It was a little island, and they had a huge lab set up. Now, they set up that lab when those foot and mouth disease outbreaks started back in like the late 1800s. That's actually when a lot of the biological warfare stuff started to get rolling. And then, it was way earlier. I even have in my book that George Washington, I have him quoted on Britain using biological weapons, 1776. He's talking about them using smallpox as a weapon against the Continental Army. And then I have several other incidents, like one, for example, where British intelligence or Britain, they sail over here in a ship called the George Washington, and they bring a cow, and they take a cow off the ship when they get here, and they bring it to a farm. And they're like, our cow has gone dry. Can we trade this cow for a fresh cow? And they do. And then when they sail off, that cow, they find out, is sick, and that caused this big it caused an outbreak of this. It's a mycoplasma. It's called contagious bovine pleuropneumonia, and it spread all up and down the eastern seaboard in the 1850s. And so that, Britain, and what, I don't know if, so John Loftus, do you know who he is? John Loftus wrote the introduction to my book. He was a Nazi hunter. His job, he worked for the Department of Justice. He would hunt down Nazi war criminals hiding in America, but he found that the DOJ was actually protecting them. Well, he wrote a book called America's Nazi Secret. It used to be called the Belarus Secret. And in that book, he was the first to make the Lyme disease connection to biological warfare in 1982. Well, he was an important source for my book. And what he was and he had a biodefense source also that I talked to somewhat as well. But they were saying that a lot of people don't realize is that Britain was actually a bigger threat to national security, or at least Western intelligence saw Britain as a bigger threat to national security than even Nazi Germany. And when you read the sleeper agent, and you can see all of these incidents where they're coming over trying to attack us and then playing us off against Germany, it really, you can really see why that would be the case. And I think, I think they are a lot more involved in a lot of the stuff than anyone realizes. And I think they do a lot to play, the British Empire does a lot to play sides off against each other.
Yeah, interesting. Let me ask you a question about let me go back in time a little bit. I don't know if you've ever read the Journal of Cabeza de Vaca, but he comes here in 1527, something like that, on an expedition. Basically, everybody in the expedition dies through a variety of means. But he and his friends survive for about 10 years, and they're going through all of these places that used to be heavily inhabited, but because of the presence of Spanish and other people there, the diseases had wiped a lot of people out. I don't think that it was believed that this was purposeful. It's just, exposure to things they hadn't seen, to include the plague and smallpox and a variety of things like that. But he saw in his journal, it's kind of an anthropology, not intended as so, but it's kind of an anthropological examination of these empty villages and saying, hey, what happened? And that disease got here. I mean, I suppose if you wanted to, you could say Spain brought something on purpose, but why would you empty a place you haven't been to that appears to be limitless, in terms of, compared to Spain? Think about how big Mexico and North America are. I mean, it's gigantic, right? I don't know. So what are your thoughts? Like, is this more accident in this case? And then later on, people realize the value of it, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's probably more like it. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about as far, I would probably say, because they, as far back as time goes, people have done things like throwing a decomposing corpse in a drinking well, so that would be a primitive form of biological warfare, But I think a lot of things they stumbled upon by accident because what happened in nature, and they're like, "Well, look at how we wiped." Well, because that is exactly what the British were saying, and like a lot of the correspondence from the people over here, like for example, one person was writing to Britain, and they billed the British Crown for blankets from a smallpox people, and they said, we're going to give these to the Native Americans. Hopefully it has the desired effect. Like it was actually, that was a proven case where they were using it as a weapon,
right?
Or trying to anyway.
Sure, trying to, yeah.
And so I think that's exactly what happened, is that they saw that, because these things that they hadn't been exposed to before, all of a sudden there's all these new people coming, bringing, all sorts, because the microbes become a part of you. Like if you settle in a certain area, like there's a microbiome in it, you know what I mean? And it becomes part of you. And then perhaps you go somewhere, totally foreign, you're bringing all this with you. I mean, that's kind of the idea. And that's actually the idea behind something called HLA, which is like this genetic predisposition of your immune system. It's why some people have a fatal reaction to this, while the other person it's a mild reaction. And I think it probably has to do with the, like the places where they came from, and staying certain places over time, they get used to certain pathogens, the bloodline or whatever, you know what I mean? Kind of like how we were saying, each place would have like a microbiome. Well, some people may have already kind of gotten used to whatever it is, or maybe this other race. And this is also the idea behind ethnic bioweapons, which is a thing. They target certain aspects of the immune system, genetic, that has to do with things like race. And even within the same races, certain populations in certain geographic locations.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to get too further than that. People start losing their minds.
No, I know. Yeah.
You already start off and I'm saying this just stating the obvious. Like you already start off in like conspiracy realm, right? And now you bring in facts like geography and genetics, and people start to lose. Like it's how do you throttle that so that you can stay consumable, but also truthful? Because I get it, and I'm here to hear what you have to say. Yeah. And as soon as you hear these things, it's like, man, like when you hear things that are hard to believe, it's hard to believe them, right? And then if you give another hard to believe thing, so how do you moderate how you address these things? You speak openly, or do you try to come back and bring me with you a little bit? What do you do?
So I source from all official documentation. I have over 1,000 citations to official research in that book. And like I try to look for any mistakes that I could possibly make, because I really am not concerned about me being right as much as I'm concerned about the truth. What is the truth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can there be more than one version? I mean, because medicine, health, these things, they're so, it's like trying to catch water on a fork or something. It's very hard to do much, because you're going to say something and be truthful. This guy's going to say something truthful, and they're going to disagree. I mean, the next time two PhDs do this, which way to go, right? And so this is not critique, right? It's just a fact. We're like, okay, let me give you an example. That way it takes you out of it. I was watching the news up in the Bay Area. I live in California, and a fire expert. It's California, right? These are all left-leaning people. University fire experts, like, well, you listen, deadfall trees, you got to leave them. It's good for the forest. That's how you manage a forest, right?
Yeah.
The other guy on the show, university grade California fire expert, says like, you have to remove deadfall trees. This isn't the same 90 seconds, and these guys totally disagree on how these things go. So even truth, I mean, it's so hard to know like what to do, like buy organic. Organic doesn't matter, it's all a scam, and with all the messaging that goes into what everybody does, it is really, on my end, it's really hard to know where to put my feet down. I'll go read an academic paper,
Yeah.
and no one's ever replicated it. So you're like, yeah, you're saying this, and someone peer reviews it, but has anyone tried to replicate it? No. And I'm like, well, then what are we doing? I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, it took me about 7 years to write that book, and it was a very, very long journey. I had to collect papers that were in German, translate them.
Yeah.
I basically collected all of Erich Traub's work. He became the focus because he had discovered that whole thing that I talked about called immune tolerance, which is basically the underpinnings of chronic disease, according to the research anyway. And it was like I had to piece together the story at the same time. And it was a lot of work. I mean,
yeah.
All I can say is I did my best to put the story forward. That was just, this is what I'm seeing. And what I try to do is look for any contradictions, like anything that I find that really does this contradict any of the other information, right? And that's kind of like my guide. I try to just like fine tune that by looking at sources from a diverse, you want to look at things like statistics. You want to also look at medical journals, scientific journals, declassified government documents, all sorts of things like that. That is basically what went into my book was, and then of course, human sources like John Loftus, for example. I communicated with him the entire time, and then his biodefense sources, and they had certain hints and stuff, and I would look into it and say, oh, if there's anything to this. And so it was so it was like drawing from a wide net.
And by the way, the link for the book is right here, everybody. And when you hear, can I call you Adam or should I call you AW?
Yeah, you can call me Adam. Yeah.
Yeah. So when Adam's talking about all this stuff, the book it's dense, it's packed full of things. And really, one of the things I love about it is it knocks me off my center. Like I'm pretty well read. And when you read stuff, I'm like, I instantly reject it, right? But then my brain fully kicks in, and I'm like, no, I gotta, because you're doing. I can see the citations being counted, and I'm like, he's doing this work. He's getting it from different sources. So when I'm saying this is, you guys should check this book out. It's really interesting. And when we think about what it takes to stay healthy, and since we have this, we have to be honest, we have this Maha movement. It's going to happen, and. I'll tell you what, it's powerful when RFK Jr. is like, I was on my knees praying to God to get me in a position to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I think about that and I'm like, that's a person who's serious about this. He's dedicated decades of his life to this stuff. You're doing the same thing. There's real people out there trying to help us get healthier. And I'll say this, even if like Niels Bohr and Einstein didn't agree on certain things, and they would have these very heady conversations that only now have we sorted out what they were talking about in theory, right? We've got some more answers. So we don't know all the answers. So as you're having a conversation and someone else is in disagreement and everything, we may sort these things out later on, with valid sources on both sides. So it is interesting. And I love the journey that you're going on. I guess let's just back up for a second. What are your thoughts on RFK Jr. with him directing HHS and trying to make America healthy again?
Well, I mean, I really definitely, I hope that it's a genuine thing. I'm always kind of cautious with politicians, no matter who it is.
Right. Exactly.
Because it just always feels like, a lot of times where and this has happened in like Lyme disease too, like with public health panels where they're getting together talking about they're going to do something finally about Lyme disease, and they do this every year, this dog and pony show, and it's like, or every few years, and it's like they get the hopes up of everybody, but then nothing becomes of it. And so after that happens so many times, you're just so used to it, you expect it, But I really hope, because on the other side of that is like, if we don't do something about this chronic disease thing, like it's going to ruin the country, no doubt.
Yeah.
Like there's already enough people who can't take care of themselves that are sick. And then you've got the neuropsychiatric diseases, mental illnesses and stuff like that. Well, all of that is also tied into this whole immune tolerance thing, because he always found that there was a neurological issue that would follow in the same footsteps, like as a secondary effect.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if we don't do something about that, we're going to be in really, really bad shape. And I really don't see like, I remember I had, I don't do this very often because I think people are get a little too dependent on it, but using that chat GPT and stuff. And I was telling it about my research, because my whole point in using it was I was trying to get its response so that I could show people who didn't believe me, hey, this is actually a logical thing that I'm saying. And it did. And we were talking and we were talking about the future of America if nothing's done about these chronic diseases, neuropsychiatric disorders, and cancers. And they said, yes, eventually, if this goes on for long enough and nothing's done about it, the country will see a broader systemic collapse. So, I mean, you got to think of it like that too. Like, and politicians, they want to hold on to their power and everything. And if there's no country, then there's really no power. I mean, so I do hope that he's going to do something about that. And even if he's genuine, he may get a lot of pushback, and I could try to.
He'll for sure get pushback.
Yeah,
he'll for sure get pushback. But is it scientific pushback? Is it systematic pushback, or is it political pushback? Right? He's got all these different ways to fight, and
probably all of those. But
absolutely,
I think there's a lot of people, though. There's so many people that are on board with it, because so many people either know somebody who's really sick with a chronic disease, or they're sick themselves. I happen to be sick myself, not as bad as I used to be, but I'm still sick nonetheless. And it's like, but I see so many other people are getting sick, all the time. And everybody's got some kind of issue going on. It's like, some kind of chronic health problem.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah.
And then
ubiquitous.
And then of course a lot of people are on psychiatric medication. Well, a good portion of people and stuff, So
I would say there's a ton of people that medicate, even if it's informally or illegally. They are doing something to abate some kind of
and now the drug epidemic makes a lot of sense. Why people are going to that, because it's like, especially when they try to go into the medical system and they really don't get any help, or worse, they're demoralized and they tell you there's nothing wrong with you. And if you keep trying to get help, they either get misdiagnosed, or you get sent to psychiatry as somatoform, which is, they say, psychosomatic.
Yeah. So I served a long time in the military, and my body's beat up from that. I've been in a lot of combat, and so my back and my hips and these things all kind of connect together. And the number one thing to relieve my pain and make my body function better, so I can maybe rebuild it a little bit, is massage. And I'm not talking like hot rock massage. I'm not talking like intense, like holy shit, this thing hurts. And the VA is great, except for the standard of care is like once a month, and I'm like, once a month.
Yeah.
Are you kidding? Like it's not enough. But they would gladly jam an epidural into my spinal column and say, here's the relief. I'm like, I don't need that. That's super expensive. Let's not do that. Let's just start with some massage. And so they changed my diagnosis at one point without even telling me. And without telling my doctor, they put it under his notes, which sounds super sneaky, but he's like, I didn't write that. That's not how I write. Those aren't the words I would use. I'm telling you, I didn't write that. So I got to believe it. And they diagnosed me with fibromyalgia, right? Which is kind of like, we don't know what's wrong with him, but he's in pain, Exactly. And so I'm in that zone where it's like, is he telling the truth? Of course I'm telling the truth. Why would I lie about this? It's miserable,
Yeah, that's exactly what a lot of people are dealing with. And sometimes it's like much worse, where it's just so demoralizing to them.
Yeah.
But the medical
I do
system,
get demoralized because if I don't reliably get the treatment, then I get mad. Then I got to go fight them, and that causes new problems for me. And so,
exactly.
and I'm just a dude. I'm just
Hmm.
some dude on some road in some town in
Yeah,
America.
yeah.
Nothing special.
Mm.
But it is everywhere. And then when we look at, I'm kind of jumping tracks here, but when we look at the amount of vaccination damage that came post, COVID, and I mean, we should all, if we don't, I've got plenty extra, know people that were, at least they attribute their lasting harm
Hmm.
to the vaccination, and I can't tell them no. Like if now they have, I don't know,
Yeah.
any of the symptoms, it's
And
everywhere.
that spike protein is exactly the same kind of antigen that Erich Traub
Mm,
was focused on. So
right.
I'm supposed to be giving a talk in March to some people, and this other guy Charles Rixey is going to be finishing it, and he's going to be
Mhm.
talking about that. But yeah, I mean, I was looking at the VAERS reports and everything. It was terrible, and I said from the very beginning, this isn't going to make it go away. This isn't
Right.
where this is not going to solve anything, and it's just going to cause a lot more harm because people are going to take it, and they're still going to get the virus and everything. But now they're going to have also, you're hearing about this thing, long vax that they're calling it.
Yeah,
Long
yeah,
COVID
yeah,
was long vax, and that's
yeah.
exactly what I would have expected. That's what I was actually saying. I even have the emails still. I was corresponding with John Loftus, and I was telling him, even before they even rolled the thing out, exactly how it was going to go down, and it did, because I
Yeah.
understood about that antigen and what it does, and it's
Mm,
not, you can't use it as a vaccine. It just doesn't. All it really does is cause all sorts of problems. And then there were all the deaths that occurred. And that antigen is something that it's like oil. When you pour oil into water, right? What does it do? Is it
mhm.
clumps together, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what it does in your blood. Like it clumps to all of your tissues. And of course, it can take to the heart. Um, and that's why you were seeing all that
Yeah.
myocarditis and
And the lungs, the micro tumors in the lungs and all of that. Yeah.
I had
Yeah.
evidence too, is that they knew, so it seemed that they were actually trying to induce that condition you know, because they knew that it hit these certain receptors. So there are certain receptors in the immune system that bring on this condition, right? Just like your brain has receptors to certain drugs, well, your immune system also has certain receptors.
Mm,
And for this thing, that's what it does, is that nasty lipid protein that when the immune system receptors are stimulated by this, it throws the immune system into disarray, and that's exactly what happened. But they knew. Oh, so there was a paper in 2012 that I had found, and it was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it was called "Disease Tolerance as a Defense Strategy," which
mm,
disease tolerance was another name for immune tolerance.
right.
And keep in mind, immune tolerance is immune paralysis. And so I was like, wow, they know all about this. And they're actually talking about using it as a defense strategy, which makes absolutely no sense if you look at the research on it, because what happens is any perceived lessening of severe disease is followed by a cascade of chronic disease, neuropsychiatric disorders, and cancers, because those were it's what I call the dark triad of immune tolerance. Like, just
Okay.
it's a term, it's a triplet. Like there's a triplet of effects that follow chronic disease, and then you get the neurological, neuropsychiatric problems, and then eventually cancer. That's another thing.
Mm,
Like Erich Traub found he could raise the cancer rate to 50% in wild mice,
wow.
with these kinds of things. And it's a potent mitogen. It's called a mitogen, causes mitosis, and it's involved in the cancer process.
Mm,
So I'm asking, like, I'm doing all this research. I'm like, why the heck are we using this? Why the heck are
right.
we allowing our entire country to inject this stuff? Like, it made absolutely no sense. And it was like, they know all about it too, because they were having all of these conferences like in the 70s after they had tried to cover it up with the Nobel Prize. They're having conferences, like the name of it was Immunological Tolerance to Microbial Antigens. So they knew antigens
Yeah.
were the cause of it. And they invited Erich Traub to that conference, but he couldn't attend because he was in Iran. But the public health officials know all about this. And they, as far in 2012, they knew about it. And it seems, the more I look at it, that's actually what they were trying to do with the COVID-19 vaccine.
Man, there's
Like
there's so much in there.
The
right?
idea, the logic they're going with is that, because it's immunosuppressive, it may lessen severe disease, but then you get these chronic diseases in its place, which is, you ask somebody with a nasty chronic disease if they'd rather just have a quick acute disease or a long, slow one. A lot of people would tell you, well, I'd just rather have an acute disease instead of these chronic health problems, because it really wears you down. And so that's the thing, is like, why would they do this and then not have something in place to deal with that cascade of problems? It makes absolutely no sense to do that when you know how it actually works. It's like to have this little Band-Aid effect, possibly. It may not even be there. And then you're going to have like the entire country sick with these slow chronic diseases in its place. And then you're going to see cancer go through the roof, mental problems. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So I'm hoping that this whole Maha thing is for real. I really, because something has to be done about it. And actually, the guy that I'm doing, so there's like a bunch of us doing a talk at some point, and one of the guys has actually moved to Washington because he's hoping to get into HHS for Kennedy. So I really do hope that they do something about this, because something has to be done. It has to be done. And when I kind of came to the conclusion in my book that there was a lot of sabotage going on, that our system had been infiltrated, for a very long time, and they were kind of using it against us eventually when they got enough people in there. And because the more I look at it, it's like, how could this not be like a hostile, some of the things they're doing, make absolutely no sense to do and cause a lot of harm. And they aren't stupid. Like if I know this stuff, right? If I'm smart enough to know this stuff, it's like they definitely know this stuff. Like Anthony Fauci, for example, had all this early experience with this immune tolerance thing. And it was like aspects of it was actually a part of his career. Like he was looking at aspects of that in his early career all the way up. And that's why he became an AIDS researcher and all this stuff. And he knew all about this stuff, but they were, how the story was constantly changing. They're like, it's 2 shots and it'll go away. You got to get those 2 shots and it'll go away. And all these people.
When we said 99%, we mean that you have the shot.
Yeah.
Like
and then after that, they're like, well, it's not gone. Everybody, all these people got the shot. It's not gone. It's coming back and stuff. And they're like, well, we think it's going to be seasonal. It's going to be a seasonal thing, boosters and stuff. And I said that actually to John through an email. I said they're going to be doing this like seasonal thing, like an influenza, and that's like it's so ineffective, the influenza one, and this is
when you act like you're not trustworthy, So first off, when it happens, like it came out of a wet market, which is right down the road from a lab, and I told my friend Kat Connor, right? She writes crime fiction. And she had just written a book about a breakout. And I'm like, hey, Kat, you predicted the future, because this thing for sure came out of a lab. That's way more sense. And like, nah, that's impossible. Not even allowed to think that, but we didn't know. And so it's like, hey, there's 2 possible outcomes here. Maybe another one. Let's slow down and think, no, we're not allowed to talk about it. You're a monster if you think it came out of a lab. And then when You think about professional people working in a lab with highly infectious things. You know what they don't want to do? Make a mistake and allow something to get out. They have all these countermeasures to prevent that. So now you have to think, you guys wouldn't even let us think this to be possible. Now it's just to guess it was an accidental thing. I don't buy that. And then Fauci's, and look, I'm not a conspiracy guy, but don't expect me to believe when Anthony Fauci's wife works at NIH and she's in charge of improving
absolutely.
shit. You're like, okay, look, quit acting like you're guilty. With all
and
the
I think they like, I think one of the tactics is they like to try to get, because war is a thing. Weapons are a thing. Nuclear weapons are a thing. Chemical weapons are a thing. But somehow biological weapons are like this big conspiracy, right? Because that's their tactic is they try to make something seem crazy. They try to, lump that stuff into like all sorts of other crazy stuff that they're trying to discredit. They don't want people talking about it because a lot of this stuff is classified. And so that's like one of their tactics to crucify anybody who starts bringing attention to it like that. And because these are things that are very real, our biodefense. So, yeah, and isn't it funny how they call you a crazy conspiracy theorist, but yet we have millions, perhaps billions of taxpayer dollars going into what? Biodefense. To protect against bioterrorism and things of that nature, and
I wasn't against Anthony Fauci at all, but I know some science. And so when he's like, you have to wear a mask, I'm like, masks are bullshit. What's he talking about? So I had a guy on who's, like a nuclear physicist guy who works, Caltech, some of the smartest people in the world. And he's like, yeah, I got hired to do some research on N95 masks and everything else. He's like, by the way, if you're positive and you fart, you're spreading the disease. It's like, and by the way, N95, he's like, here's how effective they are. He's like, you may as well take the damn thing off because it's not the way we handle them, like putting a mask in your purse and pulling it. It was all performative, right? And so here's the guy who's not telling the truth. Like, I know 6 feet. What are you talking about 6 feet? First off, you can't get sick at the beach. All these things were just bullshit. Here in California, you couldn't have your TV on in the bar because apparently TVs spread. But come on. And so when you do all these things, and this is not about right or left, it's about take it seriously. If this is serious, act like you're serious. Don't act like you're goofing. I'm not going to get sick playing golf. I'm not going to get sick playing golf. Come on. Yeah. And they didn't do that. And then, I went out and I got my shots because I want to be part of society. I'm not trying to be anybody else's problem. And now I'm not in any way anti-vax, but man, all that behavior, all that lying, all that deception has pushed me over to like, look, I would pretty reliably, I would go through streaks where I would get the flu shot. I'm not getting it anymore because I don't trust that system.
Well, I mean, we all were on that boat at one point, and I've had adverse reactions. I think the last one I got was in 2013. And it's like, and when I started to research, I saw some serious things wrong, and I'm like, because this antigen, this nasty antigen that I was talking about, it's not harmless. It's very destructive to the body, but it's in a way that is slow. It's slow, and they don't look at any of that. When they do the safety studies, they're only looking at the immediate acute reactions. They're not looking for chronic health problems.
Right,
and that's
chronic,
And this was something that was confirmed with the ChatGPT thing. It was saying, no, they're not looking at this. And because of the way immune tolerance is, where it doesn't show a lot of inflammation, they don't have antibodies, it goes completely under the radar. It goes completely and then, so you can get something, you can get a shot, and then you can have a few months go by, and all of a sudden you start having problems because it can unravel like that. And they're not looking at any of that, because if you're going to have, if you're serious about health, and let's say you're pro-vaccine, you'd want to cover all ground. You'd want to make sure. We'd want to see that this isn't causing chronic health problems. If it wasn't, and if they were looking at that and they say, it isn't, then great. But why are they not looking at it? Because when I start looking at it, I see all of these very disturbing things. And then it makes the whole thing, it makes a lot of sense why we have this massive chronic disease epidemic. Because when they were on Erich Traub's weapons, like say on the spirochete, they caused these nasty chronic diseases. But why would taking them off a spirochete and then injecting them not cause any problems? You know,
Right.
that's the way I'm looking at it. And all of this was science backed. I backed this up with extensive scientific research that shows this. And it's very concerning. And one of the guys we had at the FDA who approved the vaccine was a man named Konstantin Chumakov, whose father was a serious guy in the biological weapons program for the Soviet Union.
Big surprise. Yeah.
And he was like, he came over here with the help of Albert Sabin, and he got himself a position leading vaccine safety and review. And that's kind of, I mean, you know, without saying, okay, he could have good intentions, but to have somebody like that and give him a position, I think that's a little too sensitive for something like that. Somebody who's signing off on things that are injected to all Americans.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of trust required to accept that there's no problem there. And let me just take this in a slightly different direction. A friend of mine has ALS, right? And he's a big name in the community trying to get things done. And this is more for the audience. I think you'll be able to handle this just fine. But the uniqueness of everyone's individual form of ALS and the ability to put them through a traditional scientific battery of tests and studies. You know, you have to have like, hey, some of you aren't even going to get the drug. We got to have a placebo. And he's like, why? Just give it to us. We're going to die anyhow, you know?
Yeah.
And so you have these people that you inexorably send on this path towards death. And then when the money runs out and it's like, it only helped 5% of you guys, maybe, I guess that one doesn't work. It worked for those 5% of people, maybe. But this way science works is like the sieve is too big for ALS. And so people fly through the sieve without ever getting caught up in something just because of how we study things, just because of what we value and how you get funded. It's like, hey, 5%, we're not going to invest in that. But if that was a solution for all these people, for the most part, when Lou Gehrig got ALS back in the 30s, there's nothing different in treatment. For the most part, like it's like valley fever. When you get valley fever, they never go, and you have valley fever. They go, you don't have anything else. We're going to call this valley fever, and we're going to try this treatment path. Well, at least it's treatment for valley fever, right? But it might never get better. ALS is worse, where they're like, we don't even know how to study to make this thing stop being a problem.
Yeah, and those were some of the syndromes that they would see with these antigens too. Like I said, they would unravel in unique ways, almost unique for each person. So it's like you can never really have like a reference point, because it's like when you throw the immune system out, disease unravels in an infinite variation of ways, depending on so many different factors. But back to what you were saying about how they run things, like it's terrible. I mean, what they to be, and you know, there was a woman named Brooke Jackson who was involved with the Pfizer clinical trials, and she's now like a whistleblower, talking about how bad this is, like how, you know, because like the public health system, they could do things a lot better and actually make some progress here, but it just seems like a lot of things are more harmful than helpful, you know. Unfortunately, and because they definitely need to start looking at this whole vaccination thing, because these antigens they're using in them, the Erich Traub had, you know, these were his formula for weapons, so it's not going to make sense to inject it into you but call it a vaccine. That's you know, because it's the very same ingredient, and it was these antigens that were causing these problems. So I tend to think that there's at least some level of foreign infiltration and sabotage involved, because what they would do is, you want to go to the enemy country, infiltrate the enemy country, you want to get them into positions of power, like certain key positions in government, and then use that to try to make it harmful for the population instead of helpful, because you're actually working for foreign power and your hostile intentions, but you're under the cloak of, I have good intentions. It goes into these
Sure.
roles. That was one thing that is very real. Like, intelligence wars are always playing out, and that's
Well,
kind of
look, this is my world. I mean, I used to be a
yeah.
spy, and an unwitting source, fantastic. I can put that unwitting source through a whole bunch of gates to make them respond in certain ways.
And
And
one of
sure,
the
sometimes
books,
it fails. You just get another one.
yeah, one of the books I cited was from an ex-KGB guy called Biological Espionage, and he
Mm,
talked about how they had this huge program to infiltrate and to get people in positions exactly like what I'm telling you right now.
yeah,
And I think even though he puts some misleading information in that book, I think overall the plan that he's talking about is true, and that's what I was saying in the book. Um, they want to, it's a very sophisticated
mm,
program of
yeah,
getting people in positions in the enemy country, to try to steer it into the ground, run it into the ground, make it so that it's harmful instead of helpful. That's actually part of biological warfare.
yeah.
And
Well,
the
and
same,
have a
the same,
lobby, have a strong lobby that allows that corporation who hires that
exactly.
dude, and
And then
now he's a lobbyist.
you have the same thing in the chemical side of things. So you think
Oh,
of chemical warfare, you have
I
somebody
hate
who,
talking to you. You're making it sound horrible.
well, I mean, you just got to do
Oh
your
my
best.
God.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
no, I
know
know.
it.
I know.
It can kind of wear on you, but I don't know.
It's overwhelming, right? And
It
then when
can
you
be,
see
yeah,
the attacks on RFK Jr. before he's really even started, and there's a guy
yeah,
again. Look, I don't know. I'm skeptical, right? Like you. I hope he does well, but
yeah,
he's going to have to do it. But it appears that there's not a better guy to come in and go, "Hey, we're going to hold people accountable." I mean, we see all these things happen, all these
mm,
cataclysmic things where people are dying or whatever it's going to be. COVID. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody's at
no,
fault. And
yeah,
it's like, come on, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep allowing pharmacy.
right,
And I'm all for modern science. I'm all for things
yeah,
that make people better.
yeah,
But
but not
when you get it
harmful
wrong,
with it.
by
Yeah,
law, you got to go to jail.
exactly.
So, yeah,
Yeah, and there's so much mismanagement, outright neglect,
yeah,
or worse, going on. And that's the thing. This really does need to be cleaned up, and people need to keep hammering that point. I
yeah.
think the louder
Oh,
we get, it's like, you know, they have to they have to start cleaning this up. And I think, that I'm sure there are important people that do have good intentions
yeah,
and that
yeah,
are like, this is right. Because I've shown John Loftus all the time, like all of this concerning research. I'm like, man, look at this. This is
yeah,
terrible. He's like,
yeah.
you're right. And it took me a long time to convince him of the harmfulness of that antigen on the COVID vaccine. I was like, dude, this is
Yeah.
the same thing where they're saying this is a potent mitogen, and mitogens are involved in cancer, and that's a really big deal. And they're
Yeah.
not looking at the cancer connections. They're not looking at the chronic disease connections. This was all stuff that was, Chat GPT when I consulted it, because what I did was I took the whole chat and I put it in a link in one of my videos, and I said, okay, people, you can read this conversation, because I want people to see, who don't want to take my word for it, that this isn't just something I thought up, that it's just crazy talk. This is very
Yeah.
logical. It's based on a lot of different sources, and it was very well put together. It's eye opening. It is shocking,
Yeah.
but at the same
Yeah.
time, it's like the better the quicker we deal with it, the quicker we come to terms with the problem and actually identify the problem. Well, then we can start talking about solutions, because we can only talk about solutions when we know what the problem is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, man. I don't want to take too much of your time. This has been fascinating. I have to have you back to talk some more about this. But it's
Anytime,
it's
yeah.
eye opening. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
eye opening, and everybody should go check out your stuff. There's a whole bunch of
Yeah,
links in the remarks, but
there's a
there's the
timeline I have on my website with the Erich Traub timeline. That was a really good
yeah.
timeline I put up there.
You have a whole tab on him there, and
Yeah.
then just for everybody watching, here's the link for Sleeper Agent. Get that book. You know what I'm saying? I always say this: buy two and buddy read. Helps the guy out, helps keep him working. And look, if you are skeptical, he's got a whole page full of stuff. You can go tear it apart and disagree with them and have conversations because it's all there. The book is well sourced. I'm telling you right now, what I've read of it so far, I'm like impressed by all of actually tons of resources. And I go back and look, I do my job. I'm looking, I'm like, is that a real book? Right? Because you can put some bullshit out there, and every time there's something real to it. So I appreciate what you've done and that you're out there trying to help out. And it's not just like a let's bash something. Like, no, there's these basic building blocks that are wrong, like the antigens and that whole thing. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like a whole pillar of disease, like that has been ignored.
yeah.
You know, so it's like
God,
very
so crazy.
important. It's just so far reaching.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
Well,
I had a great time talking to you. And anytime you want to have me back on, I'd be happy to talk to you.
okay, great. Let me wrap this up here, everybody. I'll see you all tomorrow. We got at least one show, maybe two. And by the way, Adam, you can go find him. Look, it's simple. AW Finnegan. You'll find him. He's got a website. If not, look in the remarks, look in the show notes, and you'll find all that stuff. I'll see you all tomorrow. I'll be right back to you, Adam. Say goodbye. Hang on.
Awesome.